Hey guys, welcome back to The Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled people story. Imagine you're disabled and your HOA president tells you that accommodating your wheelchair-accessible RV would make the neighborhood look like a trailer park. They fined me, harassed me, and tried to steal my vehicle, but they made one critical mistake, and it cost them everything. I never thought I'd be the kind of person to get into a war with a homeowners association. I'm not confrontational by nature, I just wanted to live my life in peace, but sometimes peace isn't an option when you're dealing with people who've let a tiny bit of power go to their heads. Let me back up and give you some context. 3 years ago, I had an accident at work. I was a construction supervisor, and I fell 20 feet from scaffolding when a support gave way. I fractured both femurs, destroyed my left knee, and did serious damage to my spine. The doctors did what they could, but between the nerve damage and the joint issues, I was left partially disabled. I could walk with assistance for short distances using a walker, but for anything more than getting around the house, I needed a wheelchair. The adjustment was brutal. I went from being an active guy who spent weekends hiking and working on projects to someone who had to carefully plan every trip to the grocery store. My wife was incredibly supportive, but I could see the worry in her eyes. I was depressed for a while, not gonna lie about that. What helped turn things around was when my wife suggested we look into getting an RV. Her reasoning was that we could still travel and see the country, but I'd have a wheelchair-accessible way to do it. We'd always talked about traveling more, but life and work had gotten in the way. Now I had more free time than I wanted thanks to disability payments and a settlement from the construction company's insurance. We spent months researching accessible RVs. Most RVs aren't designed with wheelchair users in mind, and the modifications can get expensive. We finally found a 32-foot motorhome with a side door that had been modified with a wheelchair lift. It had a roll-in shower, lowered counters in the kitchen, and enough space for me to maneuver. It wasn't cheap, even used, but between the settlement money and selling my truck that I couldn't drive anymore anyway, we could afford it. When we brought it home, we parked it in our driveway. We have a 3-car driveway, and even with both our vehicles, there was plenty of room for the RV. Our house is in a subdivision with an HOA, but we'd never had any problems with them before. We paid our dues on time, kept our lawn maintained, and followed the rules. I'd barely paid attention to HOA matters beyond that. The RV sat in our driveway for about a week before we got our first letter from the HOA. It was a violation notice saying that RVs weren't permitted to be parked in driveways and must be stored in garages or off-site storage facilities. There was a citation of some bylaw number. I was confused because I'd seen other people in the neighborhood with boats, trailers, and even an RV or two parked in driveways or on the side of houses. I called the HOA management company and explained my situation. The woman I spoke to was sympathetic but said the rule was the rule. She suggested I apply for a variance or special accommodation. Fine, I could work with that. I submitted a formal request explaining my disability and why I needed the RV accessible at my home. I included documentation from my doctor about my condition and the necessity of the wheelchair-accessible vehicle. I explained that I couldn't access the RV if it was in a storage facility, which defeated the entire purpose. I also pointed out that the driveway parking wasn't violating any county codes or creating safety issues. 2 weeks later, I got a form letter denying my request. The reason given was that allowing exceptions would set a precedent and undermine the community standards. That was it. No consideration of my circumstances, no offer of compromise, just a flat denial. I wasn't ready to give up. I asked to attend the next HOA board meeting to make my case in person. I figured if I could explain face-to-face, they'd understand. My wife and I showed up at the community center where they held the meetings. There were maybe 15 people there, mostly the board members and a few other homeowners with complaints. When it was my turn to speak, I wheeled myself up to the front and explained everything again. I talked about my accident, my disability, and why the RV was important to my quality of life. I showed them pictures of the modifications. I explained that I'd already checked and the driveway parking didn't violate any actual laws or create visibility issues for traffic. I could see a couple of the board members nodding along, then the HOA president spoke. Her name was Patricia, and she lived 4 houses down from us. I'd waved to her in passing, but didn't really know her. She had that look some people get when they've been in charge of something for too long, like she was doing everyone a favor by listening to them. Patricia said she understood my situation was unfortunate, but the rules existed for everyone's benefit. She said that if they made an exception for me, they'd have to make exceptions for everyone, and before long the neighborhood would look like a trailer park. Those were her actual words. Several people in the room shifted uncomfortably. I tried to explain that this wasn't about wanting special treatment, it was about reasonable accommodation for a disability. I'd done some research by this point and found out that the Fair Housing Act requires HOAs to provide reasonable accommodations for disabled residents. Patricia cut me off and said that the Fair Housing Act didn't apply because they weren't denying me housing, just enforcing parking rules. She said I could keep the RV, just not where it was visible. The vote was 4-1 against granting me any accommodation. The only board member who voted in my favor was a guy named Tom, who looked disgusted with the whole proceeding. I left that meeting angry in a way I hadn't been since the accident. This wasn't about rules or community standards, this was about small-minded people who couldn't see past their own property values. Over the next 2 weeks, I got 3 more violation notices. Each one came with an escalating fine. First $50, then $100, then $200. Each letter threatened legal action if I didn't comply. I started looking into off-site storage options even though I hated the idea. The cheapest place I could find was 20 miles away and would cost me $150 a month. More importantly, it would mean I'd need to arrange transportation every time we wanted to use the RV, which kind of defeated the purpose of having independence. That's when things got worse. It was a Saturday morning about 3 weeks after the board meeting. I was working in my home office when my wife came in looking panicked. She said there was a tow truck in our driveway and someone was trying to hook up the RV. I got in my wheelchair and went outside as fast as I could. There was a massive flatbed tow truck and 2 guys working on getting the RV loaded. I wheeled down the ramp we'd installed and asked them what the hell they were doing. The driver showed me a work order. He said he had authorization from the HOA to remove the vehicle from the property. I told him he absolutely did not have authorization from me, the actual owner of the property and the RV, and that if he removed my vehicle, it would be theft. He seemed less sure of himself then and called his dispatcher. While he was on the phone with them, he suddenly looked at me and said the HOA had requested he call the police if there was any resistance from the homeowner. Before I could even respond, he was on his phone again, and I heard him tell someone that he had a hostile homeowner refusing to let him do his job. I was stunned. They were actually calling the cops on me for not letting them steal my RV from my own property. My wife immediately started recording everything on her phone, which turned out to be a smart move. Though honestly, we only started recording because a friend who'd had HOA problems before told us to document everything. Up until that point, I hadn't kept great records of the harassment because I didn't think I'd need them. I'd thrown away most of the early violation letters after dealing with them. That was a mistake I wouldn't make again. The police arrived about 15 minutes later. The officer listened to both sides. The tow truck driver showed him the work order from the HOA. I showed him my title for the RV and explained that I'd never authorized this tow. The officer looked at the paperwork, then looked at the tow truck driver, then looked at me. He asked if I'd signed anything authorizing the tow. When I said no, he told the driver this was a civil dispute between me and the HOA, and that removing my vehicle without my direct authorization could be considered theft. He said the driver should probably call his company lawyer before proceeding. The driver wasn't happy, but he unhooked everything and left. The officer told me I should probably get a lawyer myself because HOA disputes can get messy. He said he'd seen situations like this before, and they rarely resolve themselves without legal intervention. Then he left. I was shaking. I was so angry. My wife was crying. We'd lived in this house for 8 years without any problems, and now we were being harassed over something that should have been a non-issue. That afternoon, I started looking for lawyers who specialized in HOA disputes and disability discrimination. I found one about 45 minutes away who agreed to take my case. His retainer wasn't cheap, but at this point it was about the principle. I wasn't going to let these people push me around. My lawyer's name was David, and he was in his 50s with gray hair and the kind of calm demeanor that comes from having seen everything. He listened to my story, looked at all the documentation I had, which wasn't as much as I wished, and nodded thoughtfully. He said I had a strong case. The HOA had violated disability discrimination laws by refusing to let me have the accommodations I needed. He mentioned something called the Fair Housing Act, which apparently applies to HOAs even though they're not actually housing providers. He also said the attempted towing could be considered harassment and possibly even conversion of property, which is a fancy legal term for taking someone's stuff without permission. The lawyer's letter was thorough and laid out all the laws they'd potentially violated. It took almost 2 months before I heard anything back. During that time, we got 2 more violation letters from the HOA, which my lawyer said was actually good because it showed ongoing harassment. Finally, the HOA management company called and said they wanted to meet. The meeting was tense. Patricia was there along with 2 other board members and a lawyer representing the HOA. My lawyer did most of the talking. He explained very clearly that they had violated federal law by denying a reasonable accommodation for my disability. He said that if we went to court, I would almost certainly win, and they would be liable for my legal fees plus damages plus any fines from the Department of Housing and Urban Development. The HOA lawyer looked uncomfortable. She asked for time to consult with her clients. We agreed to reconvene in a week. During that week, I did something I probably should have done from the beginning. I started talking to my neighbors. I went around with my wife to about 20 houses in our subdivision and told them what had been happening. I was surprised by the response. Most people had no idea the HOA was being this aggressive. Several of them had their own horror stories about the board. One couple had been fined repeatedly for having the wrong shade of beige on their house trim. Another family had been cited for parking their work van in their driveway, even though the guy ran a plumbing business and needed his van. A woman 3 streets over had gotten into trouble for planting roses instead of the approved bushes in her front yard. People were fed up, but nobody had organized any kind of opposition. Everyone just paid their fines and grumbled. I started thinking bigger. At the next meeting with the HOA, they offered a settlement. I could keep the RV in my driveway as long as it wasn't visible from the street. I'd have to move it to the side of the house behind the fence line. All fines would be waived, and they'd agree not to pursue any further action. I talked it over with my lawyer. He said it was a reasonable offer and that if we went to court, I'd probably get about the same result, just with a lot more time and expense involved. Part of me wanted to fight it all the way, but the practical part won out. I accepted the settlement. Moving the RV to the side of the house was actually better for us anyway. It was more protected from the weather, and the gate to the backyard was right there, making it easier to load supplies. But I didn't stop there. See, I'd read those bylaws very carefully by this point. The same amendment that prohibited RV parking also had language about maintaining community aesthetics and preventing eyesores visible from neighboring properties. So I made sure my RV was absolutely, completely invisible from the street by building a privacy screen. I pulled permits from the county for an 8-foot privacy fence extension along that side of the property. The HOA Architectural Committee had to approve it within 30 days according to their own rules, or it was automatically approved. They sat on it for exactly 30 days trying to find a reason to deny it, but I'd followed every single county code and HOA guideline. It got automatically approved. The fence made my backyard area completely private, which was great for us. But it also meant that several of my neighbors who'd enjoyed a view of the common area beyond my property now had a view of an 8-foot fence instead. A couple of them complained to the HOA, who couldn't do anything about it because they'd approved it by inaction, but approved nonetheless. The best part? The board president, Patricia, was one of the neighbors whose view was affected. Every time she looked out her back window, she saw my fence. I'd followed their rules exactly, gotten all the approvals, and there was nothing she could do about it. But the real satisfaction came 6 months later. I'd been talking to more neighbors and not just about my situation. I'd been asking about the HOA finances. HOAs are supposed to keep detailed records and make them available to homeowners. When I requested copies, I had to ask 3 times before I finally got them. When I looked through them, I found some interesting things. The HOA had spent thousands of dollars on consulting fees and administrative expenses that weren't clearly documented. There were charges for legal fees that seemed excessive given that the HOA hadn't been involved in any major disputes beyond mine. There were payments to a management consultant that happened to share an address with Patricia's husband's business. I wasn't an accountant, but it didn't smell right. I showed the records to a few neighbors who had finance backgrounds. They agreed something was off. That's when we started organizing. The HOA bylaws allowed for special elections if enough homeowners petitioned for one. We needed signatures from 20% of the homes in the subdivision. We had over 200 houses, so we needed about 40 signatures. We got 63. The HOA board tried to fight it. They claimed some of the signatures were invalid. They said the petition hadn't been filed correctly. They threw up every procedural roadblock they could think of. But we'd done our homework, we'd followed every rule in their own bylaws, they couldn't stop it. The special election was scheduled for 2 months later. In the meantime, we formed a slate of candidates. Tom, the board member who'd voted in my favor, agreed to run for president. We found 4 other reasonable people to run for the other positions. We put together a platform focused on transparency, reasonable enforcement of rules, and serving the community rather than wielding power. We also campaigned. We sent out flyers explaining what had been happening. We held informal meetings at people's houses. We created a Facebook group where people could share their experiences with the current board. The stories that came out were infuriating. The board had been using the HOA as their personal fiefdom for years. The existing board tried to campaign too, but their message was basically, trust us, everything is fine, these people are troublemakers. It didn't resonate when people were looking at their own experiences with unfair fines and arbitrary enforcement. The meeting for the special election had maybe 45 people show up, which doesn't sound like much, but was more than triple the usual attendance. The existing board looked uncomfortable from the moment they walked in. Usually these meetings were them, and maybe 10 people who didn't really pay attention. When it came time to vote, it wasn't even close. Our entire slate won. Tom became the new president, Patricia and her allies were out. The new board's first action was to vote to conduct a formal audit of the HOA finances. They hired an independent accounting firm to review everything from the past 5 years. It took them 3 months, but when the report came back, it confirmed what we'd suspected. Patricia and the old board hadn't been embezzling exactly, but they'd been approving all kinds of expenses for themselves, paying themselves consulting fees for advice that should have been part of their volunteer board duties, reimbursing themselves for questionable expenses like meals that were supposedly for HOA business but looked more like personal dinners, using HOA funds to pay for legal opinions on personal disputes. It totaled up to over $40,000 in inappropriate expenses over 5 years. The new board sent them a formal demand for repayment. I don't know if Patricia ever paid it back, but I know she sold her house about 6 months later and moved out of the neighborhood. I heard through the grapevine that she'd found the new neighborhood atmosphere uncomfortable, which I thought was putting it mildly. The new board also completely rewrote the enforcement policies. Rules were still rules, but they were applied consistently and fairly. They established a proper variance process for legitimate hardship cases. They stopped the petty harassment and focused on actual community issues like maintaining common areas and organizing neighborhood events. Best of all, they passed a new policy protecting homeowners who needed disability accommodations. It specifically stated that the HOA would work with residents to find solutions that met both their needs and reasonable community standards. I'd like to think my situation helped make sure nobody else would have to go through what I did. As for my wife and me, we've taken several trips in the RV since all this settled down. We drove down the California coast, spent a week in the Rocky Mountains, and even made it to Yellowstone. Having that freedom back, being able to travel despite my disability, made all the fighting worthwhile. I still see Tom around the neighborhood sometimes. He jokes that I created a monster by getting him involved in HOA politics, but I can tell he's proud of what we accomplished. The neighborhood is genuinely better now. People are friendlier. There's less anxiety about getting random violation notices. The HOA actually functions like it's supposed to, serving the community instead of ruling over it. I never wanted to be an activist or a troublemaker. I just wanted to park my wheelchair-accessible RV in my own driveway so I could use it. But sometimes standing up for yourself means standing up for everyone, and sometimes the right thing to do is the hard thing. If there's a lesson in all this, it's that HOAs only have as much power as homeowners give them. When people pay attention, get involved, and hold their boards accountable, these organizations can actually be helpful. But when residents are apathetic and let petty tyrants take control, you end up with nightmares like what happened to me. I'm glad we fought, I'm glad we won, and I'm especially glad that I don't have to see Patricia's face every time I want to use my RV. The next one is a malicious compliance story. With this story, we are back at the resort where I worked multiple times. I worked at this place several different times, so I have to dip back into those earlier periods to explain how I got hired. When I was 15, I originally got a job doing room service there, and I got really good at navigating the facility. When I was 18 or 19, I started growing out my hair. I wore a headband literally 100% of the time and thought I was cool. One day, I got a call from a friend and former coworker who was very tied into the resort. The dishwashing team had walked out, and they needed someone immediately. I lived about 150 feet from the resort. They were offering me a guaranteed job without an interview and would pay me cash until I was officially in the system. The catch? I had to do the dishes for 3 full kitchens right then, with almost zero training. I worked solidly by myself in 3 kitchens from open to close for weeks until they hired help. I also lived somewhat close to the woman in charge of the entire resort, and she loved that I was involved with the resort again. She and I had always had a great friendship as neighbors. Eventually, I left to take a better paying job, which did not really help me because even though the hourly rate was higher, I worked fewer hours, had to drive farther, and spent more on gas. Then I got another call from that same friend. I got an instant job at the resort again. This time, almost the entire setup staff for banquets, meetings, and weddings had walked out. Again, it came with the same conditions as before. I had a ton of work to do, just in a different department. I later found out that the woman in charge had specifically suggested my friend call me because I was known as a reliable worker. This is where the story really begins. By then, I had long, thick hair, no more headband. I wore it in a tight ponytail that came down to the middle of my back. I should also mention that I am a guy. Knowing I was going to be a front-of-house employee with guest contact, I would shower before work and pull my hair into one tight braid. Once it was in place, I would run gel through it so the loose, shorter strands stayed down. I looked professional. Because of my unusual hiring circumstances, I rarely ever saw human resources. After more than a year working in that department, training an entirely new team, and receiving 2 customer service awards, Human Resources finally approached me. I literally had a tray of covered food on my shoulder and was about to walk into a wedding. She stopped me. I saw her glance at my hair and then she said, "We've had several complaints about you. You need to put your hair into compliance according to the handbook by the time you show up to work tomorrow, or consider this your termination notice." She said this while I was absolutely slammed during dinner service at a wedding reception with more than 300 guests. Several servers were watching and gave me the appropriate, "What the duck? Who would have complained?" comfort afterward. I put my head down and honestly do not remember the rest of the night. The next day I was in my kitchen with my future wife and my mother. We had the employee handbook open and were looking through it. I was due at work soon because we had to tear down the previous night's wedding and set up for another wedding reception that evening. We determined that I needed the job more than I needed the hair, but I liked my long hair. The section of the handbook we were looking at said, "Male hair must be kept above collar length, ponytails are not permitted." Well, okay. Ask and you shall receive. I washed and dried my hair, then went back into the kitchen. My mother had pulled out a large soup pot that fit over my head and was deep enough to stop just above my collar. Then she started cutting. I do not have a picture of this. But picture Edna Mode from The Incredibles, except with super thick hair frizzed out like the witch from the old cartoon The Sword and the Stone. We all laughed and cried equally. I found it hilarious, but we all missed my hair. I went to work, in compliance, and presented myself to Human Resources. She looked shocked to see me. I do not know if it was because she did not think I would come back, or because I looked like I had just licked an electrical outlet. I quoted the handbook and said we should be good now. She argued that I looked horrible. I pointed out that she should not shame my appearance and that, again, I was in compliance with the handbook. Then I went to work. Returning to work like that was very memorable. Everyone had something to say. Word had gotten around about what Human Resources had pulled, and then word got around about what I had done. There were a lot of laughs, but we had work to do. We had to clean up the previous night's wedding, vacuum the grand ballroom, move tables and chairs into new positions, put down tablecloths, set new place settings, and handle the whole shebang. Anyone who has worked in that industry knows exactly how much work that is. The woman who ran the resort stopped by because she always checked in before a reception to make sure our standards were being met. She saw me in the back hallway carrying a rack of water glasses into the ballroom and yelled my name. I passed off the glasses and ran over. She stared at my hair and asked, "What happened to your beautiful hair?" I explained the whole saga. I watched her body language change. Her lips thinned and she excused herself. The next time I was in the hallway, my direct boss was there and handed me a hairband. I was told to put my hair in a ponytail on the boss's orders. I thought that was the end of it. Then I started hearing rumors. She was in HR's office for an hour. HR just got walked out of the building. I never confirmed exactly what happened, but I do know the Human Resources office was empty the next day. A few weeks later, we had a new Human Resources lady. I found out because I saw someone new in the back halls. She approached me, held out her hand, and said, "You must be OP." The fact that the new HR lady knew me by name and could pick me specifically out of a crowd probably should have worried me. But I was young and stupid. My hair was in HR compliance for about 2 hours over the several years I worked at that resort. The next one is an entitled People Story. Context: I was watching a Click video and saw someone post about their journal being read. It reminded me of this story. Also, I am bad at spelling and punctuation. Growing up, I was a daddy's girl, which was egg on my face later. I also had a really bad temper because of constant overstimulation and because I was basically the family's emotional punching bag. I probably would have been the physical punching bag too if I had not been so big, but my brother and I still fought, and I would get in more trouble than him for it. My mother loved to snoop, make mountains out of molehills, and laugh off anything that did not threaten to ruin her reputation. For example, when I would get extremely overstimulated until I started screaming and pointing out her flaws, including hitting us and blaming us for things she did, she treated it like I was the problem. My mother also loved to gossip. End of context. Once upon a time in the 2010s, I was having another bad day and wanted to let out some of my emotions without getting in trouble for it again. After yelling at my mother about why she was a bad person and a bad parent, which never went well, for the record, I went into the bedroom I shared with my sister. We were early teens, so yikes. I barricaded the door and started writing a short story. I was hoping to eventually turn it into a full fan fiction about a better life where it was just my dad and me, and the rest of my immediate family had died from accidents or medical problems. Not my finest moment, but I had absolutely zero plans to let anyone else read it. It was only one double-sided page, and I planned to continue it whenever I felt like hitting someone. I felt better after writing it, so I hid it away and went back to dealing with feeling like Cinderella. Dramatic, but not inaccurate. Then suddenly my mother was holding the page I had written and freaking out. She sent me to do an overnight stay at our local psychiatric ward. While I was there, I basically did nothing, had a nice chat with the employees, and asked if I could not take the pills they were handing me because I was fine. I explained that I had just wanted to try another way of letting out my emotions that did not involve trying and failing to cast a deep sleep spell on the people who shared my genetics. Obviously, they said no because I was around 12 or 13. After that, I had to see a therapist who listened to my mother more than she listened to me, and a psychologist who put me on chill pills, which were mood dampeners meant for adults. Those pills basically shoved my emotions into a box, then sandblasted me with all the feelings at once about 8 hours later. Fun fact, never tell someone in the middle of a rage spiral to go take their chill pills and expect good results. Apparently, asking for my own space and some peace was being demanding, even though we had the room and I was nothing but dramatic. My mother, being my mother, also told everyone she knew that I wanted them all to pass on. I did feel that way at times, but mostly I just wanted to be left alone and to stop being tormented by my siblings and my mother. Years later, I now deal with permanent mild depression and a permanently dampened ability to feel emotions. Yay, I am being dramatic for the bit because my whole family is dramatic, so I might as well have fun with it. Since I have more space now and I am not being bullied basically 24/7 or constantly overstimulated, I have almost no anger issues. Gasp. I know, the shock and horror of it all. I still get angry now and then, but I just take a literal lap or do mini circles of anger, which is kind of silly but works. I take deep breaths and tell people I am fine. Then once I am calm, I circle back and have a proper conversation with the person who upset me about why it happened and how we can either fix it or find a compromise like adults. I know. Shocking. I also see a therapist now who acknowledges what I have been through and agrees with my self-diagnosis of anger out of necessity. We both agree that, while it was not the best coping method growing up, it did the trick for what I wanted and needed at the time. Now I have to start working on leaving my room more because I do basically everything in there and feel uncomfortable when I am not in my room, driving, or around my friends. Anyway, thank you for watching.